Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the sweeping, totally interconnected history of the United States, pulling directly from our source material. We're looking at how history is never just some random series of isolated events. Instead, it's this unbroken chain of cause and effect, where the decisions made by one generation dramatically shape the reality of the next. So think about this for a second. How exactly did a handful of fragile colonies forge the modern world's most powerful nation? Let's dive right into that question and uncover how history functions as a massive chain reaction. Because to understand the United States today, we have to trace the monumental steps, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the bitter compromises that transformed a sparse, uncertain edge of a continent into a global powerhouse. Kicking things off, it's important to remember that long before any European ships showed up, native peoples of North America had already developed incredibly complex, sophisticated societies for thousands of years. But the arrival of Europeans, first briefly with Norsemen like Leif Erikson, and then permanently after Columbus in 1492, triggered an irreversible age of colonization. This absolute rush to claim the New World eventually led the English to establish the Jamestown settlement in 1607, and later, the Pilgrims to sign the Mayflower Compact at Plymouth in 1620. Now, right alongside those early settlements, colonial survival quickly became entangled with the brutal reality of the slave trade. In 1619, English privateers brought 20 to 30 enslaved Africans captured from a Spanish ship straight to Virginia. That single moment literally planted the seeds of an institution that would grow to fundamentally shape the economy, the culture, and ultimately the fracturing of the entire nation over the next 2.5 centuries. As those 13 colonies expanded, friction with rival European powers naturally escalated. The undefined borders out in the American wilderness basically became a powder keg. And that led directly to a series of conflicts that would forever alter the relationship between the colonists and the British Crown. And here is a perfect example of that cause and effect we're talking about. A young Virginia militia major named George Washington actually accidentally ignited a global conflict in the Ohio River Valley. That small skirmish at Fort Necessity exploded into the massive 7 Years' War. Well, to pay off the astronomical debt from this global war, the British Parliament, for the very first time, began levying direct taxes on the American colonies, and that sparked a bitter dispute over taxation without representation. So, when the Sons of Liberty famously dumped all that East India Company tea into Boston Harbor, Britain retaliated with what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. But instead of isolating Massachusetts like Parliament was hoping for, these aggressive laws threatened the constitutional rights of all the colonists. It completely backfired, prompting them to form the First Continental Congress and prepare for unified action. Once the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, things escalated fast. The iconic 1776 Declaration of Independence, drafted largely by Thomas Jefferson, completely shifted the stakes. It took the conflict from a mere rebellion to reclaim British rights and turned it into a full-fledged revolution for human independence. It gave the struggling Continental Army a profound universal ideology to actually fight for. All right, so they pull off this incredible combined American and French victory over the British at Yorktown. But now what? What form of government would actually keep these wildly different states united? Under the weak Articles of Confederation, the central government had almost no power. They couldn't mediate disputes, control trade, or even enforce treaties. Rebellions, like Daniel Shay's uprising of unpaid war veterans, proved pretty quickly that the system was already collapsing. By 1787, delegates met up in Philadelphia. The original plan was to just fix the articles, but actually, they ended up drafting an entirely new framework for a nation. By 1788, it was ratified, and by 1789, George Washington, the undeniable hero of the Revolution, was unanimously elected as the very first president, setting precedents for the executive office that are still alive and well today. To make sure they didn't just create another tyrant like the one they just fought a war to escape, the founders engineered a genuinely brilliant compromise. They split federal power into 3 distinct checking branches. The legislature writes the laws, the executive enforces them, and the judiciary interprets them. It was a completely revolutionary design, deriving its power directly from the people. But this new constitution wasn't universally loved right out of the gate. The ideological split during ratification gave birth to America's enduring two-party divide. You had the Federalists, who argued a strong central government was absolutely essential for survival, and on the flip side, the Anti-Federalists were terrified that this powerful new federal body would just strip away the rights of individual state governments. Shifting gears into the 19th century, we see this era of aggressive territorial expansion, heavily driven by the concept of manifest destiny. The Louisiana Purchase literally doubled the nation's size overnight. And even after fighting the British to a standstill again in the War of 1812, that momentum just couldn't be stopped. By 1848, the discovery of gold in California was sparking these massive migrations westward. But we absolutely must recognize the dark effect of this continental ambition. Westward expansion required the systematic destruction of Native American sovereignty. President Andrew Jackson's 1830 Indian Removal Act forced the relocation of tens of thousands of Native peoples west of the Mississippi River. That devastating journey, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of approximately 15,000 Native Americans. Following the annexation of the short-lived Republic of Texas, border disputes rapidly escalated into the Mexican-American War in 1846. Armed with superior technology, the U.S. military overwhelmed Mexican forces. The resulting treaty secured over 1 million square miles of territory, including modern-day California, Nevada, and Utah. But, as we'll see, this massive expansion came with a very heavy political cost. Because as the map grew, the delicate balance of free and slave states completely fractured. Every single time a new Western territory applied for statehood, vicious political battles erupted in Congress over whether it would be free or slave. Compromises were bandied about, sure, but events like Bleeding Kansas, where settlers were fighting open proxy wars over the issue, proved that a peaceful legislative solution was slipping away. The nation was marching directly into its dark unraveling. Radical abolitionist John Brown's violent 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry terrified the South. And the very next year, the election of Abraham Lincoln, a candidate running explicitly on a platform opposed to the expansion of slavery, pushed the tension way past the breaking point. This led directly to the bombardment of Fort Sumter in 1861. Lincoln's election was the ultimate catalyst for the South to break away. Fearing he would use federal power to dismantle the institution of slavery altogether, South Carolina seceded in December 1860, and other states rapidly followed suit. They began seizing federal forts, effectively forcing a military confrontation that Lincoln simply could not ignore. 600,000. That is the staggering, devastating human cost of the Civil War. For 4 brutal years, the North and South waged total war against one another. From the tactical maneuvering of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to the relentless, crushing campaigns of Union General Ulysses S. Grant, the conflict tore the physical and social fabric of the entire nation apart. Now, as the conflict raged on, the war's ultimate purpose fundamentally evolved. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was a monumental shift. It authorized the raising of black troops for the Union Army, and it made it explicitly clear that the North was no longer fighting just to restore the old map. They were fighting to ensure slavery could no longer exist within the United States. Stepping out of the ashes of war following Lee's surrender at Appomattox in 1865, the nation was immediately struck by tragedy again. Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth just days later. So without Lincoln's guiding vision of unity, the federal government faced the incredibly complex, monumental task of Reconstruction under deeply, deeply divided leadership. During this turbulent era of Reconstruction, while the federal government was occupying the South to enforce new civil rights laws, the rest of the country was just exploding westward. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad physically united the coasts. It shrank what used to be a perilous months-long journey into a trip taking less than a week, massively accelerating the flow of resources and settlers. Back in Washington, to secure these newly won rights, Congress passed 3 monumental amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. During his presidency, Ulysses S. Grant even went as far as creating the Justice Department and deploying the military to crush violent white supremacist groups, like the KKK, who were actively terrorizing the South. Meanwhile, out west, this explosion of pioneer settlement created a chaotic environment that became immortalized in American folklore. Lawmen were spread incredibly thin over massive territories. Legendary events like the famous 30-second gunfight at the OK Corral involving Wyatt Earp really came to symbolize this brief, lawless frontier that was rapidly being civilized and connected by the expanding railroads. Ultimately, to settle the hotly contested 1876 election, a political compromise pulled federal troops out of the South in 1877. Reconstruction was abandoned, leaving Black Americans to face a century of systemic oppression under Jim Crow laws. Looking back at this vast web of cause and effect, from the very first colonies to a fractured, rebuilding union, we're left with a profound question. How do the ongoing ripple effects of this foundational history continue to shape the American experiment in the 21st century?